pimp my music taste. What's my music taste? Well, you could go by genres. I like this genre and this genre, but it's very particularist. You know, anyone's understanding of a genre, of a scene, will be particularly sort of catered to their taste in as far as, they can reasonably sort of customize it to not be what the usual taste is. For instance, Tool, you know, I think I appreciate it in a certain way, but still, I'm pretentious. So, obviously, I'm gonna be all new agey, like we don't understand stuff, and that's why I like Tool. I like Tool because we don't understand stuff. Then, all the other music has an instrumental purpose, pun. Uh, there's calming music. There's sort of music that you can get into a vibe with. There's more transcendental, more scientific, materialist. Um, like the Silent Hill 2 soundtrack. Um, it's very good, very Bjork sounding. It like do do boom do do. Bjork sort of sounds like Frank Sinatra, uh, if it was sort of techno, um, and a bit like loungy. It has that sort of '90s modern feel because I feel like I was born in the year 2000, so the '90s feel like the first decade where it's sort of like the past, but you're not ancient. Whereas the '80s feel just like more rural. It feels like you still have old people from like maybe the 1800s still alive then, you know? And so there's a sense to sort of the '80s. It spiked a new religiosity in people, which is actually conservatism, is the newest sort of political system. So you could judge that as modern times as much as you could judge it as not modern times. I think it's a very transitional phase, the '80s. Even the movies, they look a little strange because they look, very warm, and plenty of '80s movies can look really good, but it feels almost like neoclassical with kind of this sort of colors and everything, like The Shining, the Kubrick film. It looks great and looks very symmetrical, but it looks very much like that sort of Technicolor thing where it must be how a lot of politicians see the world. It's just like, the Home Alone 3 or 2, where Donald Trump is in the scene, use credit card, and the sort of view of the cities as some new sort of inside to go into in a lot of those movies. Like there's one movie, uh, kind of like Flashdance. A lot of '80s movies have this like before then it was very based in the cities, a lot of the movies, because maybe that's even where most of the cameras could go, and for the most part it was based in interiors because that was largely where you could get the correct lighting for stuff, and that's where you have a lot of gangster movies, a lot of noir. um which noir in particular, it manipulates that sort of uh so there's a picture in Silent Hill 3 where Heather Graham is sort of sitting in the light of stuff, and I think that symbolizes to me uh bleh, bleh. It's particularly symbolic of a sort of transition between past and future, a liminal state where you're inside something, especially like something that isn't your house, something that's you're resting in, although even though it isn't your house. So, I think that's noir with the blinds and the sort of shadows. That's what that evokes, is a sort of timeless feeling of insides and outsides. But after that, uh, you get this sort of western with more colors, with more sort of set design. And while sort of lounge music is based on the noir, the gangster film, uh, sort of rock music, psychedelic music is largely based on the western and the sort of desert. You get like Kiss and desert rock, and metal with a sort of textural basis that's more ambient. And while you could say lounge music is ambient too, uh, what ambient music tries to be is it tries to be sort of, if lounge music is the knee, it tries to be whatever this underside of the knee is. It tries to really joint on the fact that it's ambient rather than sort of exist in a sort of uh, space of conflict where ambience comes up. Uh, Silent chill. So instead of ambience, it's a Silent Hill 3. Okay, I've gotten off track. Um, so Tool and Silent Hill 2. Silent Hill 2 has a trip hoppy Bjork vibe, which I think is the electronic basis for that stuff. Like, there's a video I'll link about the Silent Hill 2 soundtrack, which is a lot of samples. It's very hip hop in that way, but trip hop because it doesn't come at it from a rhythmic standpoint, but rather a sort of lethargic, hypnagogic standpoint, which is neither rhythmic nor harmonic nor melodic. It's just textural, is hypnagogic because it depends on like what samples you use, how harsh they are, how harsh you can make them, and what you can manipulate the atmosphere to be to say, oh, this is a calming sound, but this is an annoying sound. Um, Transitioning out of that, there's other music. There's more psychedelic music than either Tool or like the sort of trip hoppy drugs. Take Percocets or whatever. You take poppers to listen to Bjork. I don't know. Do you? Which comes from a different electronic tradition, which is more ambient, and that's what I was talking about. A sort of Brian Eno, and Brian Eno had a hand in transporting krautrock to the rest of the world, I believe, through David Bowie and shit. But krautrock came up very much against the sort of lounge music called Schlager in Germany, which is very Frank Sinatra show tuney, and it's sort of like a very much a predecessor to doom metal, drone metal, like Black Sabbath, the sort of vocal technique in particular, uh, where you want like people to vibe out on it. You want it to be a sort of like a King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard sort of experience to go through. It's another one of those textural things, but instead of being hypnagogic, It's more sort of quixotic, more a bit like leavening, I think. And that's kind of the linkage that Tool has to this sort of strain, which is that although Tool is very technical and very like sonorous in a way, I think could be distracting and could be a bit corny to people. It is also, it has a lot of like Eastern influences, which make it sound particularly, you know, even with all the import and portent that is implied through it, it's still very relaxing music, but relaxing in this particular, it's not lounge music, it's not hypnagogic, it's sort of like a car trip. It's sort of Dramamine, sort of adventurous. And whereas for hypnagogic music, you're trying to sort of sort all these textures in a way similar very much to a hip hop beat to make them like, I don't know, like a Tribe Called Quest beat, sort of jazzy, but more smooth jazz. Uh, with this particular strain of ambient, drone, uh, which Boris is also like a Japanese band. What you're trying to do is kind of more achieve an activity that's the underside of the knee rather than the knee itself. And this activity will be, um, it's crucial in these sort of Black Sabbath things that are very similar in sort of poppiness to a lot of punk rock. You know, you're supposed to get that sort of mental lightness. That mental lightness is very important rather than a sort of contemplative mood or consideration or calmness. You want lightness, not calmness or not nostalgia or anything. It's very de facto forward looking, which is why you have all these people like, yo, dude, is this is what it's at. And those sort of people, I guess that tradition, you know, you can take a lot of things for granted because you're not taking a lot of other things for granted. A lot of other things like that come from futurist aesthetics that are really just based in sort of lounge aesthetics, sort of 20s, 30s metropolitan uh, sort of sinecures of, you know, reality, like the movie Metropolis or Star Trek, with a sort of basis to live in, which is, you know, it has a lot of order to it, it has a lot of presuppositions to it, and humanizes robots to a large extent, and you know, assumes this big journey and assumes, you know, a sort of a bit of antagonism toward uh, the bare aesthetic of like a western. I don't know if antagonism is that good of a word, but more of, you know, you can see the effort and the sort of presuppositions that go into sci-fi, which make it a bit clunky, which make it a bit nerdy, and that's different from like a lighter aesthetic. So I think that a contemplative aesthetic, that's why hip hop nerds, you kind of have to put more effort into it than to be a rock or metal nerd. Even though there's people who are exceptionally nerdy, like Razor Fist, about rock and have done hour-long exposés on particular bands like uh, Speed, the German band, or I don't know, this or that black metal band. Even given that, you know, there's more allowance given toward that. Now, doom metal is also the first metal. That was the first metal that sort of existed, whether it be Black Sabbath or whatever that was that came out in 1968. I think they both come in the sort of doom metal position because otherwise, in that sort of milieu, with that technology they had back then, you're just sort of making noise, which isn't quite what metal was supposed to be. Noise music would be more like experimental back then. Um, and to make it really heavy, to really emphasize that, you had to go slow. But then in the 80s, when metal really came into full momentum with like Metallica and stuff, that kind of garbage, death metal and black metal, you still have some of this like light-headed vibe to it, or it makes you want to headbang. That's how it makes you lightheaded. Um, I feel like I've sort of lost the point, so I'm going to center back to the sort of folk country part of stuff, which is a lot of places where metal uh, kind of regresses, recedes back to rock. I feel like rock and metal, you know, a lot of metal is corny. A lot of rock is actually, harder than metal, not as heavy just because of the fact that, you know, the more you weave into it, the more metal it is. And you can have simpler things which are, harder. It's hard rock versus heavy metal that are more abrasive and more particular than metal. But metal encourages a bit of homogeneity, a bit of like, if it's not the Satanistic, then it's not black metal. Or if there isn't like screaming, then it's not death metal. Or like, you have to, there's just too much musicianship in metal, too much sort of theory, too much similarity, like classical musicians, whereas rock musicians can have the liberty of being more folk, more experimental, more sort of, art music, but in the sense of what particular statement do you want to make? And I feel like in metal, that's really only contained by like drone, doom, and like sludge, maybe metal. Whereas, a lot of the other stuff, so you have progressive metal, which is like you have power metal, which is like you have thrash metal, which is like you have uh black metal, which is like you have death metal, which is like but then doom metal and drone metal can be a bit more intentional than that. They don't have to be as genred. And sludge metal too. Sludge metal can be sort of going more in the post metal direction, which by post metal I mean, well, it's similar to post rock, which, of course causes more confusion, but the post label in general is going toward a more textural format. So, like, with post rock, that's like, oh, these indie rock people are lame. Let's do. They're doing 4-minute songs. Let's do 12-minute songs. With post metal, it's sort of like, oh, this metal stuff is lame. You know, let's scream and do riffs only in 2 minutes of our like 12-minute songs. That's like ISIS is another band like that. Isis, uh, Gojira. I feel like they're a bit, but they're very progressive, so they have a bit of a fallback to them, less of a vibe. Um, so I think what particularly makes it classical is that, as well as the lightheaded vibe, you also have um, well, what does classical make me feel? You know, there's Kachaturian, there's Stravinsky, there's like uh Chopin Liszt. Chopin sucks. There's Debussy, Satie, and all of those guys, Beethoven, are very prefabricated. So, as well as lightheadedness, there's also a lot of posturing to metal, which I'm not against. I just feel like a lot of the posturing is very samey, and a lot of the posturing is like too thoughtful, even. Um, and if I'm gonna call the sort of hypnagogia of trip hop and rap, uh, especially '90s rap, and the lightheadedness of uh, like metal traditionally, and ambient music, and uh, a lot of more artsy rock, then when something is infused with classical, it's more of a pretty sound. It's more feathery, more sort of sublime, more, I don't know, experiential, that sort of melodic stuff, which sure you have to put a texture to, but it ends up more melodic. It ends up more like, oh, we're gonna sort all this sort of stuff. It's not for the people who want to listen to like a massive amount of music as much as it is for like actual musicians, and um and for sort of people who have like a story in their head, for whom they listen to music, I guess, for like particular moods, which I don't feel I do as much. I don't get moods and then listen to music because I listen to music because it produces a mood that I think, it facilitates a bit more thoughtfulness, which I don't want to be pretentious and say like, oh, I have a lot of thoughts. It's just that, there's a lot of imagination to music, which is beyond like pictorial stuff. If you listen to music, you can feel cool or whatever. Um, I suppose that's really the biggest motivation, is to give a better atmosphere than is already there, which is a bit try hard. Yeah. Uh, what's next? So a lot of funk music, and a lot of rock music, and a lot of pop music have a different texture, which is like between all of these, between pretty, lightheaded, and hypnagogic. It sort of wants all of these. It's sort of a placating vibe, which I don't think that's a negative connotation. I think like this sort of pop music vibe is like a mix, yeah, a mix of all three, where you want it to be a bit sleepy, a bit like you can pay attention to it in the background, a bit sort of like eclectic, over enthused, like this sort of lightheadedness, and a bit also like just sort of music that symbolizes something, pretty music. So I'm happy, come along if you feel like a room without a roof. So I feel like that sort of music, that's why it's very pleasing to people, because it kind of gets all those stops. It gets at the sort of netizens, the sort of thespians of electronic music who boom boom. I like those funky beats. I like those funky beats. Uh, it's notable that Germany is a home place both of like a strain of techno and of like krautrock, because techno, I do very much, I said that York is sort of like rap with a bit of hip hop with a bit of techno, a sort of techno Frank Sinatra. Especially her debut album is very chill in that way. And I feel like Death Grips in particular, they are a bit of, what do I say, they don't really have any classicism to them. What did I say were neoclassical, like 80s movies? Uh, this is sort of a mess, I realize now, suddenly. Um, so 80s movies are a bit of a transition, as I said. Then 90s movies, along with this sort of neo lounge aesthetic, which is very spacey. It's a very spacey vibe. If you listen to like In Meshes, that's NMESH, Frank Sinatra restyling, then you sort of get that sound, the infinite revius, space anime sound of sort of uh, Maho Shotengai, Kikiyama, no, not Kikiyama, Kokoyama, Yokohama shopping log, that sort of apocalyptic feel, but it's more Shinsekai, New World aesthetic in the 90s, like Power Man 5000, When Worlds Collide, that music video, which I feel it's a very internet character. Two things, which whereas before the 80s, you know, the U.S. had this very city identity, uh, which in the 20s, the sort of white flight began to start, where more of the population of cities was immigrants. That was when a lot of population decline happened. That was the first sort of suburbanization, hollowing out of city centers. Then the 50s, this happened again. The 60s, immigration laws were changed. Um, then by the 80s, you have the sort of dying out and yuppification of cities, the sort of first gentrification, I'd say, that I'd say became a term in the 80s with the first like bankers and like Silicon Valley stuff. Silicon. So the 90s picture I have, and I realize this video is sort of boring now, but I'm just trying to like put across an aesthetic. Like 90s music, I feel is very like loungy, very much hypnagogic. What is love, baby? Don't hurt me. Sort of born in the 80s, but whereas the 80s got the 70s disco music to house music, the house music is more just poppy. It's in the center of everything. So whereas you can have like, oh, girls just wanna have fun, girls just wanna have fun, girls just wanna have. That's all they really want. Just wanna have fun. What in the world can they do? A lot of that sort of post-punk new wavy sound is still just, a certain part of it is that krautrock moved to the nouveau Deutsche Welle, the new German wave, which is like Kraftwerk and stuff. Kraftwerk used to be a krautrock band, then it became a new wave band. Uh, so the new wave bands took influence from funk, whereas before disco took influence from funk. Uh, and that's a reason because funk is very much like a maybe a fourth sound besides being pretty, being lightheaded. I'd say it's a fairly lightheaded sound. It's kind of metal in that way, but not quite. Besides being hypnagogic, it's more of like a the texture of that is like a party texture. It's like pop music for people who actually like pop music. It's more like it's similar to metal and like the melody line, but it's different uh, because it's trying to sound nasty. That's funk. It's funky. It smells. Uh, so funk moves to house music, and house music sort of turns into techno. I'd say "What Is Love" sort of sounds a bit techno, but I'm pretty sure it's house. And the reason that distinction is important is because sort of house, whereas you can see trip hop as sort of techno Frank Sinatra. House is more just Frank Sinatra, like a big sensation or house music. What was that sample? Some particular very famous sample in house music. You know, it's more lively, more funky itself than post punk in comparison. Again, there's a tapeworm here that's distracting me from my main point. I'm drawing a lot of circles. Uh, what am I trying to put across? I put across that girls just want to have fun. What is love? Uh, I think I'm trying to put across why 80s sound is sort of different because I feel like a lot of 90s pop music is not pop, but most 80s pop music could be considered pop today. Um, like even Backstreet Boys in Sync are a bit of a genre work in music, a bit sort of loungy, a bit like yo rap, R&B, which pop music nowadays is a bit dying. I see it particularly as like Kesha, Lady Gaga, uh, fucking Rihanna, Beyonce, Katy Perry, just women singers with a lot of woes and ohs in their songs. What is love? Baby, don't hurt me. So, the character of house music is similar to funk music in this sort of spacious sound, but it goes more in the direction of, well, what in particular? I'd say a lot of electronic music has a bit of a classical sound that you're trying to get a repetition to it, but you're also trying to get a sort of serialization that fits a song. But instead of the sort of trip hop serialization which wants to be hypnagogic, you're more moving in a pretty direction with house music, and you're not really moving in a lightheaded direction either. Well, somewhat, but it's more just pop music. You want to sort of dance less than particularly zone out. That'll be a consequence, but you know you can have some yuppie dance to house music, but you'd have to be really hardcore to dance to techno music, which I suppose is a distinction that makes it this particular. It's not quite pop music, but it is pop music nowadays. But it's not. It's sort of pop music for people who listen to pop music, but not for people who listen to electronic music. I'll have to exposit on that later. I've woven a bit too much of a tapestry, I think. But so 90s music is this techno lounge, techno Frank Sinatra. 2000s music I feel is where a lot of 90s music is like a lightheaded sound. Like Earth, Boris, but 2000s music is where I think that's really borne out. Like white girl piano music, uh, which includes making my way downtown, or no one else can feel the rain on your head, feels like it's very similar to Boris, or a bit of Tool, Kiss, The Last of Us soundtrack, which the Last of Us soundtrack, what I'm trying to put across is that 90s music views cities from this detached perspective of that's where you go to club. That's where you're clubbing. And that's also where you go to relax. You go into the cities, but the cities themselves are a bit too chaotic, which is why 90s music has this new suburban character that in the 80s music people rebel against the suburbs. You have a bunch of people from Orange County, California, which is outside of LA. It's a suburb of LA, different county, which a bunch of punks rebel against that. In the 90s music you have not anti-suburban music but explicitly suburban music, uh sort of new agey, looking to the rural character of the rest of the world to uh, justify your sort of super rural character in the suburbs. Are they suburban or are they super rural? Um, that's where you get Enya, a lot of new age music, and I feel like that's the main connective thing between the node of uh, so pop music for people who like pop music, or dance music is the fourth node, and dance music isn't supposed to be either pretty, lightheaded, or hypnagogic. It's just supposed to be exciting. It's supposed to be dancey. Dancey, I guess, is a good adjective. Um, and you can have dance music. The reason why dance music isn't pop music is just it's too good of pop music. Um, but the link between hypnagogia and lightheadedness, those sort of contrasting head states, is what's the link? I was just thinking about the link, but I haven't quite thought it up. I forgot it. I just literally forgot it. Oh, house music? Is it house music? I'm expressing a whole lot of stuff, but I feel like the interjections, feel the rain on your head, no one else can feel it for you. The interjections kind of helped, but hypnagogia plus lightheadedness, what is that? Okay, so what I did to get here is that the suburban quality is very uh particular to hypnagogia. Then the dance quality, it's pop music that's too good to be pop music. But then the maybe I should stop just about now because I've woven this and it's a bit, fucking shit. It's a bit of a subterfuge. But I think there's a particular link between uh, lightheaded, uh, maybe in the zone, not really in the zone because that's a bit like of a preppy, but like zoning out, woke. Enya, I was gonna mention Enya. Fucking why at this time you have to like take notes to get what the fuck I'm talking about. I have sympathy. I have Enyapathy. I'm an Enyapath. Oh yes, yes, yeah. The particular link between uh hypnagogia and lightheadedness is that both krautrock and uh like the sort of Enya world music stuff tries to look toward more world aesthetics. But the difference is that I think Hypnagogia is more Chinese and Lightheadedness is more Indian. It looks more towards Indian rhythms, which can be progressive without like being in your face about it, without having to like contain it in the song structure, which I think is a difference between progressive and sort of like drone sludge post rock, which is still like sort of weaves this like progressive sound, but it doesn't sound particularly in your face about putting across that pretty aesthetic. It's not trying to be pretty, it's just trying to be woven together to sort of put you across this long road. I walk this lonely road. Ah, da, 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 da. All these worlds and worlds, and I walk alone. Da, 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 da. I walk alone, and I walk a. Um. So yeah, I feel like I'm almost done. In that, you know, and I'm gonna probably draw a sort of aid as like a the thumbnail for this video to help. It's sort of pretty, dancey, lightheaded, and hypnagogic. And that's the four kinds of music for the four kinds of music fans. I yeah, I think that roughly covers it because uh, the lightheaded, you know, that goes from like bald to like really long hair. The like me. And the hypnagogic, you kind of prefer to have like a particular hairstyle to do that. Like maybe half of your head is shaved bald. You have like a mohawk, but the mohawk is a bit more electronic. But electronic, you sort of want your hair more retarded looking. Then the classical, you kind of accept all hairstyles, is what classical does. They don't really care. Um, God, this is a yarn. This is a certified yarn. But I'd say there's different sort of axes. Like when you go, I'm sort of seeing it as a political compass where if you go to the left, then you're very lightheaded. If you go up, you're very um, hypnagogic. That's sort of trying to get you all into the Borg. If you go down, you're very dancey. That's trying to get some chaos into the mix. But chaos doesn't really work into structural stuff. It's more identitarian. And if you're going to the right, that is good. It's good that the right is sort of the main retarded thing. If you're going to the right, You want everything to be embellished and stuff with like reasonability, rationality. So I think the reason that sort of works is that um, you have, moving this way, a sort of textural basis which finds more of music in general similar, because what makes music more than melody, rhythm, or harmony being a certain way, I think, is just the texture of it, that you can tell it's music, because it's not just harsh. And that's also implicitly allowing harsh music. I think a lot of noise music, for instance, harsh noise, power electronics like that stuff, Merzbow, is, well, where would that be? Somewhere in the lightheaded aesthetic, uh, trying to sort of make fun of metal and classical. Uh, Maybe you want people to get fucking dancing to it. Maybe you also want people to chill out to it. So it's sort of a centrist as far as hypnagogia versus dancey, lightheaded versus pretty. It's like very lightheaded. Maybe not too lightheaded. It can be a bit more center lightheaded. Um, so if you go in that direction of both lightheaded and hypnagogic, you get more world music. And if you go in the direction of uh, both dancey music and pretty music, rather than world music, you get more written down music, more prefabricated music. If you go in the direction of both hypnagogic and pretty, well, I didn't think about that actually. Like classical music, that's also pretty. I guess you get more sort of like Enya, more sort of that uh, newer classical music, or like neoclassical, symphonic, like feel good music, like operas. Um, and sort of world classical music, I'd largely say has a sort of hypnagogic feel to it, like um, though that's also lightheaded, very not dancey, very top side of the spectrum is the Ghost in the Shell Bulgarian polyphonic choir. um, the polyphonic choir, Radio. This is a long video. It's about the Joshua L video length. I think I'm about done. But I've sort of paced this very badly. Uh, Not at all, really. Silent pauses, silent pauses, silent pauses. So, going in that direction, it's a more Enya thing in that top right square of the political compass. That's pretty and hypnagogic. It's also a bit more like post rock. Well, post rock is also, top, less dancey, but a bit more sort of, I don't know, the sound of animals fighting, that sort of thing. Or very centrist would be in particular, uh, what's that band? Who did the new the the new Dark Age, MGMT, or Management, I don't know. They're a bit centrist, but they sort of leave out, I'd say, they're not a very light-headed band. So they're sort of right side of spectrum, a bit dancey, a bit pretty, and um a bit hypnagogic is MGMT. Uh Post rock is, the top side of spectrum. The left side of spectrum, the sort of left of the y-axis is what I mean, is that would be a lot of noise music, harsh noise, power electronics. And then the south of the x-axis would be, let's see, I already put it as this here is both hypnagogic and uh, lightheaded would be world music influenced stuff. Both, so maybe like fusion might be a bit like this, but that's also trying to be pretty. So like just world influence in general, not trying to also get all that jazz bullshit in there, which is like classical. Um, this is like uh, Enya, both hypnagogic and pretty, not particularly trying to get a rural aesthetic to it. Um, this, the pedophile part of the political spectrum is both pretty and dancey. I'd say that's like jazz fusion. And then, let's see, dancey and lightheaded, I'd say is a lot of like jungle techno. Ugh. So then extrapolating from that, this will all be on the chart. This will all be on the thumbnail I make the chart out of. Um, the sort of bottom. hmm, Well, the right contrasts with the left in that on the right side of the spectrum is like MGMT, on the left side of the spectrum is Merzbow. So then, what would contrast with top down? Uh, that would be, well, on the top. This is real lag. It's gonna be over soon. The suffering will end soon. Um, Post rock, Bulgarian polyphonic choir. So in contrast to that, on the bottom would be, I don't know, on the bottom, linking both pretty and lightheaded. I might come up with it later. The thumbnail is going to be the whole thing here. The thumbnail. Well, linking the bottom right, which is jazz fusion, with the bottom left, which is like techno, jungle. I guess the bottom left, my voice is hoarse now. Time keeps on slipping, slipping, slipping into the future. Bottom right is like house music. Yeah. So bottom right would be particularly signified by, I don't know, Skrillex, Avicii. And then bottom left, you might call um, the. Hmm, wait, that's Dancy and Lightheaded. I don't know, like Gorilla Toss, like Lydia Lunch, like Talking Heads. So with that, I end the video. Yay.